A few months back, we released a video where we'd asked the question, does your functional threshold power matter? And the answer was that yes, actually, it does. But that as a measurement of your ability and as something from which to base your training on, it's actually really quite crude because it measures just one aspect of your ability, an important one, but only one of many. So if, for example, you have an amazing anaerobic engine, it's not going to tell you. If you have an amazing sprint, it's not going to tell you. And so if you are basing your training zones and your training plans around your FTP, you might not be training effectively and you might not be making the training gains that you otherwise could do, despite putting in the hard work. So in this video, we're going to explain why that's the case and then shed some light on how you might be able to fine-tune your training to take advantage of it. And we're going to do so using the Sufferfest 4DP training app as an example. Because, funnily enough, we were not the first people to come to this conclusion, not by a long shot, but there has been this rise in recent years in online training apps that actually don't take other power values other than your FTP into consideration. Some, however, do, one of which is the Sufferfest. And they got in touch following our previous video because last year they launched what's called their 4DP training app, which is where you choose from a variety of training plans that are tailored to your own personal power profile, a four-dimensional profile, if you will, gauged from one rather brutal sounding hour-long test. You want me to do the test, don't you? I've got to do the test?
Yeah, of course you do.
Go on then. The 4DP test is done on an indoor trainer. We're using the Wahoo Kicker, but you don't need such an advanced bit of kit. You will, however, need something with which to record your power output. The test comprises of 5 individual efforts of different durations. After a quick warm-up, we have 2 5-second all-out sprints, then a bit of recovery before a 5-minute effort to gauge our maximal aerobic power. Then, with legs feeling a little ropey, it's a 20-minute all-out effort to gauge our FTP, before a final sting in the tail, a 1-minute max. Happy now? Yeah, I am too, a little bit. Gotta love a fitness test, even if they are blooming hard. They are still remarkably satisfying at the end, and who doesn't enjoy having sore legs at the end of the day? You'll be wanting to know the results, I'm sure. I think the exact wattages are not necessarily terribly relevant here. What is the rider type that the Sufferfest kindly works out for us. So, am I a sprinter? No. Am I an attacker? No, sadly not. I am a time trialist, which isn't the end of the world. It's like Rowan Dennis. I'm just much, much slower. What is interesting, though, is the fact that we made Chris do the full frontal test as well. Sounds really dodgy, I know, but that's what it's called. And he is a very different rider type to me. So when you compare our power profiles, we are very different. Chris can outsprint me any day of the week with just one leg, whereas although our functional threshold powers are remarkably similar, because I have about half the muscle mass that he does, I can therefore climb better and also time trial better as well. Now, you can see also that given our FTPs are the same, if we were to base our training purely off that figure, Chris would not be taxed anywhere nearly enough at anything other than his FTP, whereas for me, it's not all that far off. The threshold-based training zones are in white, whereas Sufferfest 4DP is in grey. Longer efforts, as you can see, are closely matched, but there's quite a significant deviation in the shorter efforts. And for Chris, you can see this is even more extreme. And yes, he is clearly more powerful. So, to truly understand this, I think, and to grapple with Chris's extra sprint power and anaerobic power, we actually need to understand the physiology behind it. So, get ready. It's quite complex, so we're going to do our best to simplify things. Your genetics dictates the proportion of skeletal muscle fiber types that you have. So you will know, I'm sure, about fast twitch fibers that sprinters have and slow twitch fibers that endurance athletes have. Now, importantly, you cannot convert one type of fiber to another through training, but it isn't quite as simple as that, because actually within the category of fast twitch fibers, you have two distinct types. You've got type 2X and type 2A. 2X are the absolute fastest, but also the most susceptible to fatigue because they rely on a completely different energy source, phosphocreatine. And those are the fibers that really explode over 5 seconds to 10 seconds, so your absolute sprint power. Then type 2A are actually nearly as fast, but they are much more resistant to fatigue. So these are the ones that really power your anaerobic capacity, your AC power. And actually they also play quite a large role in dictating your maximum aerobic power as well, MAP. Now, the reason being is that they rely on glycogen as their fuel, which is far more abundant than phosphocreatine, meaning that they are much more resistant to fatigue. So if we go back to the comparison of Chris and myself, I think it's fairly safe to assume that Chris is going to have a far greater proportion of type 2X and type 2A fibers than I do. What I rely on is the type 1 slow twitch fibers. Now, these have much greater resistance to fatigue than the type 2s. However, they are never going to be performing particularly fast. So your type 1 fibers are not going to win you a sprint. And you can't, unfortunately, train them to work any faster. What you can do, though, is train them to produce more power over time, so effectively boost your FTP. And so on that point then, I think it's probably time to move on to training. Much of the training for type 2X, so your pure fast twitch fibers, remember, is probably best done off the bike, because to boost your max sprint power, you need to build more muscle fiber, and then to get them to work for longer, you need to supply them with more fuel, so more phosphocreatine. And coincidentally, even at the other end of the spectrum, to improve your FTP, so to improve your aerobic power, that actually also comes down to fuel to a certain extent. So in order to supply your muscle fibers with more blood, with more oxygen, you need to improve the capillarization of the muscle tissue, so literally supplying it with more oxygen. And then also, to utilize that oxygen, you want to develop the mitochondrial density within your cells, so more little power plants that use that oxygen in glycolysis. Are you still with us? Quick, can we play some loud music or something? Show Chris's bulging muscles. There we go. Yeah! Woohoo! Look at that. Right. That's enough of rippling leg muscles for one moment. We should get back to the job in hand. And unfortunately, we've kind of had the simpler part of things. It's when we start talking about those 1 to 5 minute efforts that are in the middle of the power profile that things get really complicated, which is annoying because actually when you think about it, those are probably the most important durations of effort for a bike rider. I mean, the ability to follow surges when you're on a fast-paced group ride, or the ability to ride up a short climb, or steep bits of long climbs, even accelerating away from a traffic light. All situations where you're putting demands on your body in excess of FTP intensity. Now, I've always kind of referred to it personally as strength endurance, so that feeling when you're able to make those little efforts again and again and again. And it's funny, you know, when I look now at my power profile, the numbers aren't a gazillion miles away from when I was racing full time. But yet I know that were I in a racing situation, I would very quickly come unstuck because I'm lacking that muscle endurance. And I know this because I see it every time I do a GCN challenge, the Three Peaks Cyclocross, for example, or the Taiwan KOM challenge. But yet, it's not my endurance per se that's lacking, because I also know from stupid GCN challenges, like trying to ride with Mark Beaumont, that I can actually ride a push bike at a reasonable pace for 17 hours. So instead, it is that endurance to repeated harder efforts beyond a 1 hour ride or a 2 hour ride, 3, before. And I didn't know it when I was racing full-time, unfortunately, but that endurance is one of the crucial aspects of training your type 2A muscle fibers. If you wanted to boost their overall power output, you can do so through training by building more muscle fibers. But often that's not actually what we're after. What we want is the ability to keep repeating the same power output, but again and again and again. And it's when you start to get your head around this most fundamental point of training that you then start to realize that limitation of basing your training off of FTP. Because if you are blessed with type 2A fibers, and it really is a blessing as we can see as a cyclist, then you absolutely want to maximize your training to take advantage of that as much as possible. You don't want to go too hard, which I guess is the risk if you're training off heart rate or just on perceived effort, because in that case, those type 2A fibers won't be working aerobically, they'll be working anaerobically, which is a different thing entirely. And of course, there's the risk that you won't be able to do the correct number of efforts or the right number of minutes in training because they will be too fatigued. But on the flip side, and arguably far more dangerous from a training perspective, is if you don't go hard enough, because then you simply won't be getting the training effect.
Holding back for the 20-minute test will ruin your life.
So you can see, I think, that even from this oversimplified version of your very complex physiology, the importance of training at the right intensity for you, for your genetics, and for your goals. So you can see then from this the takeaway points. It's important to recognize those different energy systems, and your training needs to touch on all of them. It also needs to be at the correct intensity to get the desired training effect. But as an extra layer of value, it also teaches you an awful lot about your own body and your perceived exertion. Because while we don't want to become a slave to power, if you're aware of how it feels, it's an incredibly valuable skill when you leave the pain cave and go out onto tarmac in the real world. And on a personal note from all of this, I think not recognizing why I was doing certain things from a more scientific perspective gets chalked up as another one of those little mini regrets. Potentially, if I had thought more about training those type 2A muscle fibers, I'd have done more to coax something else from them, which potentially might have helped. Who knows? Now, one last point to mention as well. We touched very briefly on strength training off the bike. I think it's important to say that the Sufferfest actually have modules in their training plans away from the bike. So strength training, also mental training, which I thought was kind of cool, and yoga as well, which James, weirdly, has become absolutely obsessed by.
Inhale, lengthen. Take smooth and even breaths in and out through your nose. And to your chest, rising and falling. Keep your gaze fixed on one point on the ground in front of you and try to stay as still as possible.
Well, I'm sure that commitment will see him reap the benefits from that. Yes, in this specific case, we have been using Sufferfest as an example, but the points that we've discussed here are true whether you set your own training, whether you have a coach, or whether you use a service like the Sufferfest. I think for many of us, it's really fundamentally important to actually understand why we're training in a certain way, as well as giving us the confidence that the training that we're doing is going to be of benefit. So, the take-home points are you need to know your strengths, you need to train at the right intensities, so work as hard as you need to and touch on all the various different important points. So there we go. If you would like to see a little bit more information about what type of rider you are, but not specifically about your physiology, more about your mentality, we have a video on that very subject. You can get through to it just down there.